Let's get started. Great pleasure to have Cassandra Gaston from University of Miami here visiting today. Before I start introducing her a little bit about her education, etc., a few words. She has been and is collaborating with some of our folks, with John Mark, Jen Wang, and myself, but I just saw there are even more connections with B&L folks like Ernie Lewis and Steve Propé from our institute. So it's very wonderful to have you the first time in person here. A few words to Cassie. She did her BA in environmental chemistry in San Diego, but then did another Bachelor of Science in biology, because she just told me she thought she goes into medical sciences, but then our colleague Kim Fraser at San Diego Scripps took her on as a graduate student, and she did her PhD in atmospheric chemistry, working on single particle mass spectrometry. Then she went for a postdoc to the University of Washington with our dear colleague Joel Thornton, and learned more multi-phase chemistry, uptake coefficients of N2O5 by particles. That makes Steve, of course, smile, and me too. And after that, she became a faculty member at the University of Miami, is an associate professor right now, very productive, successful. She was awarded an NSF Career Award, which is a huge milestone for a junior researcher. She also got an MRI grant from NSF. And I think, and she has several awards, outstanding papers and EST and other journals. But I think what the community really greatly appreciated, and some of you may know, there is a famous mineral dust or atmospheric observation center on Barbados, and it was formed by Joe Prospero, and it measured for 35 years long-range transported air masses, especially dust plumes coming from the Sahara. And Cassie took that on, so she's running this observation now. Took that on from our dear senior colleague Joe Prospero, who's still around, I heard.
He's still active.
Still active with 94? Or
yes.
With 94. So there's no end, it seems. So that's great. And and that is greatly appreciated by the community, that you took the helm of that and run it despite funding issues, etc. And so with that were my last words. And so we are happy to have her here. The title of her talk is The Impact of Dust and Beyond on the Marine Biogeochemical Cycles. Welcome, Cassie.
Thank you so much.
You just go ahead. I want to just hide that.
Perfect.
Now, and we click, let me click it once. Now it should work.
Perfect. Yeah, so thank you again for the invitation. I'm really excited to talk about really a compilation of work that we've done since I started at University of Miami. I'm mainly going to talk about atmospheric deposition and its role in marine biogeochemical cycles, but I'll also talk a bit about atmospheric deposition to the Amazon basin as well. And a lot of the work is going to focus on this measurement site that Dan just mentioned, which is in Barbados. So this is one of my photos, favorite photos of the measurement site. And so just taking a step back, like, why focus on dust? Why are we so interested in understanding African dust transport? And Joe Prospero really set the tone for the importance of this research. So what I've done is I've taken one of these satellite images from his paper, and this is showing Africa on the bottom. And then you can see South America and the Caribbean islands at the top. And there's a few things that stand out in this image. One, you can see this massive dust plume that's traversing the North Atlantic, and it's having an impact on a very large swath of the North Atlantic basin. Two, you can see that the color of this dust is very different from the underlying ocean as well as the clouds, so this has some obvious radiative implications. And I've highlighted Barbados here because it's the easternmost island in the Caribbean. So the reason why we're going to focus so much on measurements at the site is because we really only get oceanic emissions or Saharan dust at this site. So it's really an ideal location to understand African dust transport. I'll also talk a little bit about another site, which is in South America, the site in Cayenne. It's also a similar receptor for African dust transport, particularly in the winter and spring. So a little more background on why we study dust. For those of us who live on the East Coast and have to worry about hurricanes, dust is thought to modulate tropical cyclone intensity. So during periods when we get sort of a lag or a pause in hurricane activity, you can thank dust for that in part. Two is that dust can serve as an ice nuclei or a giant cloud condensation nuclei. I've also highlighted some work in red from a former student of mine who's looked into this effect. Another reason to study the dust is that we actually see much larger dust particles all the way in Barbados than what you would predict from Stokes settling velocity. And so there's been a lot of questions as to how these large dust particles stay lofted, but even more importantly, it's really caused climate modelers to rethink the radiative properties of dust. So now there's been speculation that Saharan dust actually has a greater warming potential in the climate system than we previously thought. Another reason to study it is because it has nutrients such as iron and phosphorus that can be transported to these receptor ecosystems, both the North Atlantic Basin, as well as the Amazon Basin, and this impacts carbon sequestration. And then another reason, and this is inspired by my conversation with Ming Hao, is that whenever we get dust transport events, we regularly see particulate matter concentrations that are considered unhealthy to breathe. So if we think about the World Health Organization's cutoff of about 45 microgram per cubic meter of air, we easily exceed those concentrations. And so there's been a lot of questions about what are the health implications of this dust. For today's talk, I'm mainly going to focus on the biogeochemical aspect and thinking about dust impacts on biogeochemical cycles. So a little bit of background on how this works. So as the dust is transported, it can deposit into both marine and terrestrial ecosystems. So there's been some really nice remote sensing work done by Hong Bin Yu's group, and he's estimated that about 139 teragrams of dust is deposited to the North Atlantic Basin per year, and something on the order of about 28 teragrams of dust is deposited to the North Atlantic or to the Amazon Basin per year. Now, when we think about dust deposition to terrestrial ecosystems, it's very different from how we think about it for marine. And the reason is residence time. Once the dust deposits into the Amazonian soil, even if the nutrients aren't readily bioaccessible, they can undergo chemical weathering and processing in those soils. Now, the process looks very different for dust deposition to the ocean, and that's because once the dust deposits, it can rapidly sink out of the euphotic zone. And because of that, there's a much bigger emphasis on understanding not just what nutrients are present, but how soluble they are in seawater. So I'll talk a lot about solubility. And this is really relevant because a lot of the nutrients I'll discuss are very recalcitrant, meaning they don't like to dissolve necessarily in water. So we'll have to think about what mechanisms might enhance the solubility, as well as are there other players involved in this process other than dust. So once these nutrients are delivered, this can increase primary productivity. And what this would do is stimulate an increase in the photosynthetic drawdown of atmospheric carbon dioxide, and this would induce the cooling effect. Right, the most famous example of this is from John Martin's 1990 paper, where he said, "You give me a tanker of iron and I'll give you the next ice age." So this is trying to understand those processes from a more modern take, and also from thinking about more tropical ecosystems. So Natalie Mahowald's group at Cornell has also tried to put a number on what are the radiative implications of this process. So if we look at the aerosol direct effects and the aerosol indirect effect via aerosol-cloud interactions, these are both processes that have been well studied. They're both processes that are represented in the IPCC reports. But if we look at the aerosol indirect effect because of biogeochemical cycles, we see a radiative forcing that's on par with these other two more well-studied radiative forcing estimates. However, this isn't included in IPCC reports because we simply don't know enough about how this process works. So that gives us good motivation to try to understand, how does this work? What are the key atmospheric players, and what are their impacts on these ecosystems? So I'll talk a bit about iron. This has been the more classically studied element, again, from that John Martin paper. And the reason why iron is so well studied and of interest is because there are a lot of regions of the ocean that are dubbed high nutrient load chlorophyll. So if you add iron, stimulate primary productivity. There have been some really nice iron addition experiments that have been done in the North Pacific as well as the Southern Ocean. And then for our more lower latitude ecosystems, like I'll be talking about today, iron can actually stimulate nitrogen fixation. And so this can relieve nitrogen limitations in part of the lower latitude ocean. So I'll talk a bit about iron today. But I'm also going to focus more heavily on phosphorus. And this hasn't been as well studied as iron, but it's actually going to play a really key role in our more tropical ecosystems. So for the Amazon basin, there was this really nice study that came out in Nature 3 years ago. And what they're showing is these are soil transects along different tropical forests in Central and South America. And what really sticks out is that the Amazon basin in particular is very phosphorus depleted. And so what this same group did is they did nutrient addition experiments, and they looked at what was the primary productivity response if we add things like nitrate, calcium, etc. And they really got the largest response when phosphorus was added. So this is really highlighting a need to understand phosphorus inputs in particular for understanding primary production in the Amazon basin. Now, if we move over to the oceans, Chris Moore had a really nice study that came out 12 years ago in Nature Geo. And what he showed was looking at nutrient limitations and co-limitations in different parts of the world's oceans. So what I'm showing you here is a map of surface phosphorus concentrations. And then these circles with the perimeter around them are showing different nutrient co-limitations. So what we can see for the North Atlantic is we see very low phosphorus concentrations, particularly at the Sargasso Sea. And then these circles with the black perimeter represent co-limitations of nitrogen as well as phosphorus. So this provides a lot of motivation to understand phosphorus deposition to these different ecosystems. Now, as I mentioned, dust alone is thought to have these very refractory minerals, so not a lot of bioavailable minerals for mineral forms of iron and phosphorus. However, dust is a key player in heterogeneous chemistry in the atmosphere. So what can happen is dust can interact with acidic gases such as nitric acid, sulfuric acid, organic acids, and these can induce proton dissolution of these refractory minerals. And so minerals like apatite, which is what the main mineral containing phosphorus, goethite, hematite, or iron-containing minerals, they can undergo proton-driven nutrient dissolution. And this has actually been a process that's been really well studied in the laboratory. So I'm showing two figures from two different papers. What both of them are showing is an exponential increase in phosphorus on the top, iron on the bottom. So in nutrient solubility as a function of pH. So the more you acidify these particles, the more you release soluble nutrients, right? And we can actually see that this process happens quite regularly with Asian dust. But a couple of the outstanding questions are, one is how much acidic processing is happening on dust over the remote Atlantic, right, where we don't have a lot of megacities, right? I'm also going to look at this question and how it's changed over time with the passage of the Clean Air Act, which curbed sulfur dioxide emissions. Two is, what's the role of particle size versus chemistry, right? This is a debate we see a lot in the aerosol-cloud community, and I'm going to bring this debate also to the nutrient dissolution community. And then three is it all about the dust? Or should we be thinking about other aerosol sources? So I'm going to compare dust to volcanic ash as well as biomass burning. All right, and a lot of these measurements are taking place at Ragged Point in Barbados. If you take nothing else away from this slide, just take away it's a beautiful place and you should come do your research with me because we like having collaborators visit. So we made long-term measurements here since the 1960s. By we, I mean me and Joe Prospero. And what we do is we have this walk-up aluminum tower we collect high volume aerosol filter samples at the top of this tower. These are collected every day. So we have long-term record of these daily filters since the 1960s. All of our filters are archived. So even if you don't visit, if you have a research project and you want to look at some historical data, contact me. I'd be more than happy to share portions of our filters with you. So this is a paper from Nikita Zaidova, who's our department chair in atmospheric sciences at University of Miami. So she published a paper in BAM showing the climatology of dust transport in Miami versus Barbados. So you can see a peak in summertime dust transport. And what I'm showing in the photograph on the right is what one of our dust filters looks like. So we use a portion for our chemical analysis, and then we archive the rest. And this is about the size of a sheet of paper. So we end up having a lot of aerosol mass to play with. So again, if you want to do any collaborations with us, please contact me. In addition to this aerosol record, we also have AeroNet measurements that have been active since 2007. And then we also are part of NOAA's carbon flask program. So we've been measuring atmospheric carbon dioxide at the site since the 1980s. All right, so getting a little bit into some of our research questions, I'm first going to start out looking at iron solubility in volcanic ash. And there's a few reasons why we're interested in this question. One is there's a lot of paleoclimate data suggesting that volcanism might have been responsible for getting us out of these sort of warm climate periods. There was the really famous paper from 1993 called Atmospheric CO2 Stalled. And the idea was that the eruption from Pinatubo might have induced a biological response in the ocean, causing carbon drawdown. And then also there was this really nice paper that review paper that came out in 2010, reviewing everything that we know about volcanic ash and putting out the hypothesis that volcanic ash could be as important, maybe even more important than dust, for supplying phosphorus and iron to the ocean. And so we were able to take advantage of two volcanic eruptions that happened in the same year. So we got a volcanic eruption that happened on the island of St. Vincent, which is very close to Barbados. This was the La Soufrière eruption. Probably the scariest text message I ever got, which was, "What do I do if a volcano is erupting?" And my initial response was, "That's a good joke." And then I got a video. I was like, "Oh my God, run!" They did sample that, which was, I did appreciate that. And in hindsight, I appreciated it. At the time, it definitely caused some heart palpitations. So this is actually a still from one of the videos of Asa. And then there was another eruption that happened in the Canary Islands. This is the so-called La Palma eruption. I'm going to refer to it as the Cumbre Vieja eruption. So, and what we did was we collected some ash samples, and we first did electron microscopy work to see, what does this ash look like? So the first thing that jumps out is, wow, the ash looks totally different from these two different volcanic eruptions. We can see that the Cumbre Vieja ash, these particles were huge compared to the ash that we got from this La Soufrière. And so that got us thinking, maybe we can answer questions in addition to thinking about ash versus dust. Maybe this would also be really good fodder for looking at that particle size versus chemistry debate as well. So that's what we did with this work. And so what I'm showing here is analysis from 4 different samples. So 3 of them were collected near the Cumbre Vieja eruption, and then our 1 sample that we got from the La Soufrière. And so what I'm showing is total iron, soluble iron, and iron solubility. Now the iron solubility that we measured, we did an acidic leach, and the idea was to mimic processing of dust, or ash in this case, through the sea surface microwave. So the idea is that these minerals can maybe be consumed and go through zooplankton diet where they'd be exposed to high acidic conditions. So this is essentially an upper limit of iron solubility. Solubility is what I'm showing. And so if we look at our measurements, we can see that for these 3 Cumbre Vieja samples, we're getting the same total iron. which you would expect, it's from the same eruption. But the solubilities are very different for these three different samples, even though it's coming from the same eruption. And so that begs the question, well, what's going on here? Why are we getting such different solubilities from the same eruption? Is there something going on with the atmospheric processing? Is there something going on with the mineralogy? Is it a size thing? And then also notice that for La Soufrière, you see a lot less total insoluble iron. So we wanted to understand that a little bit better as well. And so what we did is we partnered with Andy Alt's group at University of Michigan to understand what is the size distribution of this volcanic ash. And the idea that we wanted to test is that smaller particles should have a higher surface area to volume ratio, and they should undergo more complete dissolution. And so we should see higher iron solubility from these smaller particles. So what I'm showing here is size distribution of ash from La Soufrière on the top, Cumbre Vieja on the bottom. And this is from a Coulter counter. And what you can see is that we have very different size distributions as you would expect. The Cumbre Vieja ash is a lot larger in size compared to the La Soufrière. So we would expect the La Soufrière to have higher iron dissolution. But that's not what we see. We see much higher iron dissolution for our bigger particles from Cumbre Vieja. And so this is suggesting that the particle size isn't really the dominant driver for iron dissolution. So maybe it's a chemical effect instead. And so what we did was we took our ash samples to the Pacific Northwest National Lab, PNNLs, several of us do some collaborative work out there. And they have these really great instruments where we can probe single particle chemistry as well as mineralogy in greater depth. And what we did is we performed this technique called Mossbauer spectroscopy. And it essentially just allows us to look at iron oxidation state as well as iron mineralogy. And first thing to notice with these two samples is this really strong doublet that we see for both ash samples. And that's indicative of iron 2. So if we did the same technique on our dust samples, we mainly see a singlet, which is indicative of iron 3. And that makes sense, right? Dust has been exposed to the atmosphere a lot longer than volcanic ash has, so it should have a more oxidized iron state. So the second thing to notice about these two samples is that more of the iron from the La Soufrière eruption is bound in iron oxides. And that's shown in these red colors here. Whereas more of the iron from the Cumbre Vieja eruption is bound in these iron silicates. And that's significant because there's been a number of papers that have suggested that iron in silicates is a lot more soluble than iron in oxides. And this is just simply because of how strongly the iron is bound into these mineral phases. And so this suggested to us that the mineralogy is really explaining the differences in solubility and is playing a more dominant role than the particle size. So we also did some XPS analysis to look at surface chemistry. The other thing we noted about these Cumbre Vieja samples is we saw a lot more fluorine associated with them, indicative of hydrofluoric acid processing. Right, so this is suggesting, again, that mineralogy and influence chemistry is really explaining the differences in solubility that we observed. So the other thing that we wanted to do was we wanted to do a deposition estimate and see, well, how much soluble iron are we dissolving to the North Atlantic, and does it matter, right? And so what we did was we took the dust deposition from Hongbin U, and we took iron solubility data that we had collected from some of our dust filters, and we came up with an estimate of about 0.53 teragrams of soluble iron is being deposited from dust each year. And then we took our data from the La Soufrière and Cumbre Vieja eruptions, and we also took our size distribution data to estimate deposition velocity. And so we estimated anywhere from about 0.1 nanomolar all the way down to much, much less, so picomolar levels for La Soufrière. And this is on par with estimates from this more recent paper that came out from Galletto et al. And so what we conclude is that the the dust is really the dominant source of soluble iron here, right? But that the volcanic eruptions might be really important episodic additions. So the volcanic eruptions might be deposited in regions that don't get impacted by Saharan dust, or maybe during different seasons when the Saharan dust isn't as active in that region of the ocean, or maybe just adding as an additional like tipping point, like providing enough iron to rule things like nitrogen fixation. So the next thing that we did was we wanted to also look at phosphorus deposition from volcanic ash versus mineral dust. And the reason why we wanted to do this is because we know even less about phosphorus deposition from ash. And so we had these really two major events that happened in 2020 and 2021. So 2021, I mentioned, was the La Soufrière eruption, but then in 2020, we had this massive dust outbreak, which was so huge, it was coined the Godzilla dust event. So Joe is the one who came up with this nickname. And this is showing a satellite image of this dust plume. So it impacted the Caribbean islands. It also impacted the Gulf Coast and parts of Florida. And this is just giving you an example of how much dust we saw on our filters. So this lightly colored brown bar here on the right is a typical June concentration of Saharan dust. And then these filled in or solid brown bars is what we observed. So close to 200 micrograms per cubic meter of dust. So this was truly an unprecedented event. And so we wanted to look at these really high deposition scenarios and ask how much phosphorus did they release, and what does this do? How does this impact marine microbes? So the first thing that we did was we did a leaching experiment, because we kind of said we have no idea how to work with this stuff. How long do we leach for in the first place, right? And so what we found is we did a leaching experiment, found about 15 hours is the optimal time to do this leaching. If you go further than that, what happens is the phosphorus starts to reabsorb to the dust because of the presence of iron oxides on the dust. So that was the first thing. But the second thing that really pointed out to us, that really stuck out to us is, so we've measured phosphorus solubility on dust for years now. We usually get somewhere in the ballpark of 5 to 10% of the total phosphorus is soluble. So we expected something on par or maybe higher for the volcanic ash. We're at about 1% or less. So that was really surprising to us, right? What's even more surprising is that the models have that 100% of the phosphorus in volcanic ash is soluble. So they're way off by orders of magnitude, right? So that was also another surprise, is that the phosphorus in volcanic ash is just a lot less soluble than we would have predicted. Now we wanted to take our measurements a step further. We didn't want to just ask, okay, how much soluble phosphorus is released? We wanted to really know what is the impact on marine microbes, right? We're just inferring an impact when we look at solubilization of nutrients. We wanted to take this a step further and also really take advantage of the fact that we have an oceanography department that does incubation. So why not leverage their expertise? So what my former student did was we took seawater from the dock of our pier, and we took nutrients that we have leached from a filter containing our Godzilla dust, some of that volcanic ash, and then we had a control experiment where we had a filter that had was a blank, essentially a procedural blank. No aerosol had been collected on it. So we spiked our seawater with these aerosol nutrients. And then we also added a radio-labeled phosphate tracer. And what we did in our incubation is, over a period of time, we would take an aliquot from each one of these bottles, we would filter it, and we collect the microorganisms on our filter, and then we measure the radioactivity. And that tells you how much of the radio-labeled tracer gets taken up, and that can serve as a proxy for the aerosol phosphorus also being taken up by these microbes. And so these are the results from her incubation study. And I'm parsing them between volcanic ash on the left, African dust on the right. And I'll walk you through what we have, because there's a lot of data points on these plots. So these sort of dashed lines that are black on the bottom, those are our kiln controls. So what we did is we did this incubation and then we killed all of our microorganisms to ask the question, is the radio tracer just absorbing to the cell walls and not really being taken up by the microbes? And the answer is no. Like all of our phosphorus data seems to indicate we're actually seeing active uptake of aerosol phosphate by our microbes. The other thing to note is we get massive uptake in the very first time point that we take. So these organisms are phosphorus starved, and as soon as they get exposed to these nutrients from our aerosols, they rapidly take up that phosphate, right? The other thing to note from this is that we did different aerosol loadings for these experiments. So we did high loading representative of these, like these high, like dust storm events or these high deposition events. And then we did a lower loading condition. And so the loading didn't really matter for our dust. The microbes responded the same no matter what. But it really did matter for our volcanic ash. So we actually see a suppression of phosphate uptake when we have really high concentrations of volcanic ash. And what we're curious about is there something toxic in the volcanic ash as well that's maybe suppressing some of this? And we wanted to answer this question, but the unfortunate thing is that when you do all these experiments with phosphate, you leach in a bicarbonate solution, and ICP-MS really hates bicarbonate solutions. So we've been rethinking also how to do some of these leaching experiments. But the bottom line from these experiments is that the volcanic ash actually does provide bioavailable phosphorus. It is taken into marine microbes, but overall, the dust has higher nutrient solubility for both phosphorus and iron. And so maybe the importance of volcanic ash has been slightly overstated, right? It's probably important in regions where you don't have a lot of dust, but in regions where you do have dust, if we had to compare the two, the dust certainly seems to be winning out. All right, so now I'm going to move and talk mainly about dust. So I'm going to focus on dust. And one of the questions that we had was, okay, the dust seems to be more important than volcanic ash. Does that mean it's undergoing some sort of chemical aging? And if it is, how has that aging changed over time? And reason why we wanted to pose that second question is in the 90s, there was a lot of clean air policies that were enacted both in the United States and in Europe. And this reduced concentrations of sulfur dioxide gas. And why that's important is sulfur dioxide gas gives us sulfuric acid. And this is a really potent acid for inducing that proton-driven dissolution of minerals in atmospheric dust. So some of the legacy samples that I'll show, we don't have a good pH measurement for. So what I'm going to show is non-sea salt sulfate, sometimes see this NSS, and that's going to be our proxy for acidity in lieu of having a better measurement. All right, so first, I'm going to walk you through some of our more present day measurements that we have of this. And this was from a field campaign that happened in 2020. Yes, we did field measurements in 2020. As soon as we came back, we all got quarantined because of this thing called COVID that broke out. And I had sent my student thinking, okay, we're just going to measure sea spray, and that's okay. It'll, we'll learn something. She is my good luck charm. I was very sad when she defended because every time she went in the field, she got something cool. So what we ended up getting during this wintertime campaign was these 3 massive dust events, which were kind of unexpected for us. And along with this dust, we also saw the co-transport of smoke from northern African agricultural fires. So what I'm showing in this figure here from her paper is the measurements from our traditional filter sampling, which I mentioned we've been doing since the 1960s. So on the bottom, we can see these spikes in dust mass concentration. And then what I'm showing on this upper panel is nitrate, which can be a proxy for maybe nitric acid, non-sea salt sulfate, and oxalate. So these are sort of our acid proxies in lieu of having a better measurement And we can see these really strong temporal correlations between our acid proxies or chemical proxies for aging and dust. So historically, we would say there's a correlation, the dust is aged, right? But we were a little skeptical about this because we know that there's more than just dust in our filters. So this is where we wanted to take a step back and really probe this mechanism from a single particle perspective. And so what we did was we performed single particle analysis back at PNNL. And what I'm showing is a representative microscopy image of dust. Most of the dust that we observe at Barbados is internally mixed or sort of coagulated with sea spray. And we can see from this particle, this blue is our sea spray, and this warmer color, that's our dust. And so if we look at the elemental composition of these two different components of our particle, the dust doesn't have a lot of sulfur and nitrogen associated with it. But the sea salt has a lot of sulfur associated with it. So, at first glance, you could say, well, Cassie, there's sulfate associated with sea salt. So that, maybe that's what explains it. But the chloride's depleted, right? And so what this suggests is that we're seeing some sort of processing of the sea salt component on these dust sea spray mixtures. So two hypotheses is that this well-known heterogeneous acid displacement reaction, where sodium chloride can react with sulfuric acid, this would liberate hydrochloric acid into the gas phase and lead to the production of sodium sulfate. Another plausible mechanism is this mineral dust sea spray aerosol mechanism that John Mack has spent quite a bit of time looking at in his measurement set, right? And this would lead to the production of molecular chlorine gas, right? So either one of these mechanisms potentially explain our observations. So we kept seeing this again and again on all of our particles. We also looked at dust associated with smoke. And again, we see a similar story. The dust doesn't really show a lot of signs of chemical aging, whereas the smoke does. And so what this is suggesting is that even though we see this correlation from these traditional markers or these traditional bulk measurements, the single particle analysis is telling us a completely different story, which is that we're really seeing a lot of the aging is taking place on the sea salt component or on the smoke component rather than on the dust for these internally mixed particles. All right, so then we wanted to also go back into the past. And that's where having these legacy measurements can be really, really helpful. And so what I'm going to do for this part of the talk is really contrast these two different measurement sites where we have long-term records of aerosol. So Barbados, I've already talked about, but I'm also going to bring in Bermuda. So we also have a long-term measurement record for Bermuda. And what's unique about these two different sites is Barbados is more remote. Bermuda is very close to North America, so it's getting more pollution from pollution outflow. What's also unique about the Bermuda site is that you have the Bermuda High, right, which can sort of essentially pick up your Saharan dust, transport it clockwise, and then that sort of forces the interactions between the pollution outflow and the dust. So it's a really ideal site for looking at this. Also, we have the legacy data that spans the time when the clean air policies were enacted. And so what I'm showing here are two different figures from Bill Keen's paper on the top and then my paper on the bottom. And we're both showing the exact same trend, which is a reduction in non-sea salt sulfate over time, concurrent with the passage of the clean air policies. And they match very, very nicely with the community emissions data set inventories of sulfur dioxide reductions. What I'm also showing is the dust records for Bermuda and Barbados. You see interannual variability, but the dust transport really hasn't changed, right? It's been pretty steady over time. So the really only thing that's changed over time is the presence of this non-sea salt sulfate, which is, I mentioned, is our indicator for acidity. So what my student did is she took this a step further and she focused only on summertime measurements and only on filters where we have appreciable dust loadings. And she looked at whether this non-sea salt sulfate trend holds over time for just filters where we have a lot of dust. And again, we do see that very strong correlation where upon passage of the Clean Air Act amendments, we see a very strong reduction in non-sea salt sulfate with a sharper decline in Bermuda than Barbados, which is exactly what you would expect given the proximity of Bermuda to North America. So then we wanted to ask, well, what does this do to soluble phosphorus? Does that change? And so we did these soluble phosphorus measurements. We did them a little differently than for the previous experiments. We did our leaches in Sargasso seawater instead of in bicarbonate. And this was so that we could look at a whole suite of metals as well, and not be so limited in our analysis. And so I was expecting maybe we'll see a slight correlation, but this blew me away when she showed me her results. And I'll walk you through what we got. So our data is colored by year. So the warmer colors are the early 90s, so right after the passage of the Clean Air Act amendments. And then the cooler colors are the late 90s. And so what you can see is a really strong reduction of about a factor of 3 for soluble phosphorus with a reduction in non-sea salt sulfate. And especially for Bermuda, you can see it colored by time, right? Where the late 90s, we see less non-sea salt sulfate, less soluble phosphorus compared to the early 90s. The other thing I want to note about these experiments is we designed them such that we use comparable dust loadings between all the filters. So what that means is that the real changes here are the soluble phosphorus and the non-sea salt sulfate. It's not that the dust loadings go up or down for these different samples, right? So what we can say is that it appears that this acidic pollution reduction, because of these clean air policies, has had implications on nutrient delivery to the North Atlantic basin. And that would have implications for nutrient stress, as well as thinking about primary productivity. All right, so we see this change in dust acidity over time and nutrient dissolution over time. And so then the final question that we had was, okay, we've looked at dust, we've looked at volcanic ash. What about smoke, which is also another aerosol type that we see quite frequently at our measurement site in Barbados? Well, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring you further south to Cayenne in South America. The reason why is that the dust and smoke episodes that we get in Barbados are less frequent than what we get in our South American site. So this is a really great receptor for getting that winter and springtime dust and smoke that's coming from Northern Africa. So, and we do have a measurement site there. It's not as fancy. We don't have a tower. We just have a simple highball sampler, and that's it. But it works. It gets the job done. And we've had a continuous record there since 2013. So we've had about 12 years of filter samples. And similar to the site in Ragged Point, really all we're seeing is sea spray and African aerosol. So again, it's a really ideal measurement site. You can see the water right here. So I'll walk you through what our aerosol record looks like. It looks very different from Barbados, where we had that summertime peak. So in Cayenne, we're mainly getting peaks in dust in the winter and spring, right? So different seasonality. And we also wanted to compare and contrast this dust season with non-dust season. We wanted to understand phosphorus associated with Saharan dust because we wanted to know something about Saharan dust being fertilized the Amazon. She's been a really popular hypothesis, been around for a couple of years now. And so these were actually our first soluble phosphorus measurements that we made in my group. This is when I first started out as an assistant professor. And so you can see our dust concentrations in red. The bottom is showing our total and soluble phosphorus data, blue and green, and then the percent solubility is in black. And so what you can see is what you would expect. If we look at correlations between total phosphorus and dust, we see a very strong correlation. The dust is bringing phosphorus with it. And we see some limited solubility, but we do see a couple of episodes of higher solubility, which we'll get into in a bit. Right? We also see this very classic trend where if you increase the dust loading, you see a lower solubility, which people see throughout these different nutrient records for phosphorus, iron, you name it. So then we wanted to contrast this with non-dust season. At first we thought, okay, we're not going to see very much. This will be uninteresting, right? I love surprises. So for our fall record, you can see, as we expected, a low dust loading, so in red. But if we look at the phosphorus data, we were really surprised with why are we seeing phosphorus levels on par with dust season, even though we went from like 120 micrograms per meter cubed of dust to less than 10. What's that about? Why is it that this phosphorus is so soluble? We're at something like 20 to 25% solubility, whereas for the dust, we're at 5%. What's happening there? So we also looked at our trends, and again, we see no trend between soluble phosphorus and dust, a very thin trend between total phosphorus and dust. So this is suggesting that something other than dust is providing our soluble phosphorus. And so what my student did is she generated a climatology for air mass back trajectories. Where are the air masses that we're sampling coming from? So in winter and spring, as we would expect, we're sampling North African aerosol. And then in fall, we're getting a lot of transport from Southern Africa. And that's significant because that matches the burn cycle in Africa. So in winter and spring, you have these agricultural fires in Northern Africa. And then in summer and fall, you get these grassland burns in Southern Africa. And when we looked at our filters more carefully, we did some electron microscopy work. It's a little limited because this is on cellulose filters and not TPM grids. But if we look at our winter and spring filters, we see dust and we see soot. If we look at our fall samples, we see soot. So this is suggesting maybe the smoke is what's driving a lot of the dynamics of what we're seeing. So to probe this a little more carefully, we combined our back trajectory analysis with Calypso data. So this is showing an elevated smoke plume from Calypso being transported from the South African coast. And we can actually use the Calypso overpasses to track this plume over time. And so following this plume further on the 22nd of September, we again see that elevated smoke plume. And we see it make its way all the way to our site in Cannes. So we did this analysis for every day of our sampling, and we see this consistent trend where when we see this sort of transport dynamic, our soluble phosphorus is elevated. When the smoke plume doesn't make its way to our site, we don't see that elevated soluble phosphorus. So this is really suggesting that the smoke plumes are actually driving a lot of the dynamics of the soluble phosphorus we're seeing at the site. So then we worked with Natalie Bothwald's group to quantify, well, what does this mean for the Amazon basin? So we compared dust to this African smoke, right? Mind you, dust is what the models have been looking at all along, right? The smoke is an additional player in this now. And so what we see is two things jump out. First is that from the model, the smoke from Africa is providing up to half of the total phosphorus that's being deposited, and it's providing it mainly when the dust is low. So it's basically, if you add the smoke to the dust, you're getting a continuous supply of phosphorus rather than just a supply in winter and spring. The second is that the phosphorus in the smoke is much more soluble. And so you can have a more bioavailable form of phosphorus being deposited. Now, we also did the same thought experiment for the ocean. And so we looked at the percentage of soluble phosphorus from smoke. And we could see, as we would expect, there's a lot of soluble phosphorus coming in the South Atlantic. And this is because of smoke from both Africa as well as South America. We see a small tail in the tropical Atlantic. Right, there is a lot of dust that's also being transported, but we do see a small amount that's also being coming from the smoke. So we estimate that the smoke is providing between 20 to 60% of the soluble phosphorus. Now, the other thing to note is this tail here going towards the Southern Ocean. And so what this is also suggesting is that the smoke is also providing soluble phosphorus to higher latitude oceans. All right, so wrapping this all up and thinking about what we've learned from all these measurements, first lesson we've learned is that these traditional samples But these traditional filter-based approaches are great for quantifying soluble phosphorus, soluble iron. But marrying these techniques with single particle really helps you get a mechanism. Okay, how much soluble phosphorus or soluble iron is there? Now, who's driving this? Is it smoke? Is it dust? Single particle techniques can really help us unravel this. They also can help us unravel aging mechanisms. Who's being aged when we see nitrate and sulfate? Is it the dust like we've traditionally thought, or is it something else? Second, we've shown that composition appears to be playing a more dominant role for nutrient solubilization than size. I've only shown this for volcanic ash. We still need to look at this for other particle types, right? But this is, providing a really important insight into what's the dominant mechanism. Third, non-dust is becoming more important for nutrient delivery deposition over time, right? We're seeing more and more biomass burning events occurring, more of that smoke being deposited over the ocean. So this is really important for thinking about phosphorus delivery. There's also been some nice work that's looked at soluble iron from smoke as well. Volcanic ash, right? The nutrients in volcanic ash, at least from the eruptions we looked at, were less soluble than those of dust, but this still may help relieve nutrient limitations, particularly in areas that aren't big dust receptors. And fourth, we've shown that these air quality policies have impacted dust aging and nutrient solubility. So this may exacerbate already phosphorus-stressed ecosystems like the Sargasso Sea and affect the efficiency of the biological pump. This is something we're looking into through incubation data that we did in the Sargasso Sea. And we did see a major difference in primary productivity between our early 90s versus our late 90s samples. So in this last point, I don't want to leave you with the impression that I'm trying to say that these clean air policies were a mistake. It's absolutely what I'm not trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that, aerosols have masked climate or global warming through direct aerosol-cloud interactions and through this biogeochemical cycling. And now that we've enacted these very necessary clean air policies, we're running out of time to deal with the issue of greenhouse gas emissions. So with that, I'll leave you with my acknowledgements, and I'd be more than happy to take any questions. And thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for this really nice talk, bridging geoscience, marine science, and atmospheric science pretty well, actually. We're open for questions, and I check also in the chat if there are questions coming up. So please. Hey, Jessica.
Thank you so much for your talk. I took a lot. I do have a question regarding some of the aging timescales of these particles. So do you have a sense of the aging timescales of these sulfuric acid dust particles? And then also when you talked about some of these dust sea spray, do you have a sense of that timing? Particularly when you start to see measurable changes in composition.
Maybe try to repeat it quickly so they can hear it online.
Yeah, so the question was about aging timescales for things like dust, sea spray, how quickly are they reacting with these gases? So we've approached this question from both the lab and the field, right? In the lab, these reactions are fast. We can induce chemical aging of dust very rapidly when we react dust with things like dinitrogen pentoxide. The field is different, and the reason why is because of how the dust is transported in these distinct aerosol layers, right? So the dust is transported in this layer that's been dubbed the Saharan air layer, and it's sort of rising above the marine boundary layer where you'd expect a lot of your emissions, right? So that really does beg the question, the time scale, right? How quickly is the dust reacting with these gases? Does it have enough contact time in order to induce appreciable aging? That's a good question. For Bermuda, I would say the contact time's a lot longer because of that Bermuda high, right? Where you're sort of pushing the dust in the same path as this pollution outflow. But for Barbados, you're in a very remote area, right? Where you don't have a lot of sulfur dioxide emissions. And so that's a real question. One other question that we've had too is, how has this mechanism changed now that we now get sargassum blooms regularly in Barbados? And this sargassum is great at emitting sulfur-containing compounds like dimethyl sulfide. So how have we perturbed the system not through anthropogenic emissions, but maybe by changing the marine biogenic profile, right? I think the chemical aging part of the talk has honestly brought up more questions than it's answered. So that's a good question. I mean, it really is all about the contact time. And I think another thing that we're curious about too is how much of the mechanism of the dust, sea spray, coagulation, as well as the aging is happening in cloud. So we have some evidence that we see a different profile above cloud versus below, but our particle statistics are kind of low on that. So we need more aircraft measurements to answer that question.
Nothing.
So iron limitation of primary productivity has been shown to be more pronounced typically in the Pacific than in the Atlantic.
That's right.
Which has had people look particularly at the influence of Gobi dust and its influence on iron deposition in the Pacific. Have you, or has anybody compared the dissolution of iron from Gobi dust versus Saharan dust? Are they similar? Do they behave the same?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we've been working very closely with Cliff Buck at University of Georgia. So he set up a measurement site in Hawaii to look at the Asian dust and to look at the iron dissolution dynamics. So he and Nick Halco have been looking at this question from the Pacific. And we've been working with his lab to look at the iron dissolution in the Atlantic. So we have a few measurements from our site. He has a lot more measurements from their Pacific sites. So that's the idea, is we want to compare these two sites. One thing that I will say is that their time series, they definitely are saying more acid processing, just because the Gobi dust is going over these large mega cities. There's a lot more pollution gases that the dust gets exposed to, for one. And for two, there's also a lot more volcanic activity, so you get a lot more degassing of sulfur dioxide that you process the dust to.
Also, on your microbial experiment, were the microbes phytoplankton, or were they your mix of bacteria and phytoplankton?
So it was a mesocosm experiment, so it was whatever was in the ocean. So part of what we started doing was we started using flow cytometry to look at changes in phytoplankton versus heterotrophic bacteria. So I didn't show the results because they're pretty new, but with the more acidified dust versus the less, we did a cruise in the Sargasso Sea, and we showed that we see a higher photosynthetic activity for our acidified dust, and we see a huge increase in phytoplankton compared to heterotrophic bacteria.
Yeah. And your time zero surely was not time zero, was what, some minutes after time zero?
Correct, yes.
What was that? Was it
about 15 minutes?
so,
Yeah.
So you saw a pronounced uptake within 15 minutes.
That's right.
And why did it go down so sharply at one day?
So we think part of it is bottle effects. We think part of it is bottle effects. So you get bottle effects because you know, you're limiting your experiment to these really small bottles.
How small are these bottles?
Like 125 mils, right? And so it's not representative of what can happen in the open ocean. We see the same thing with some of our dissolution experiments, right? We stop bleaching our filters after 15 hours, and that's because we get reabsorption of phosphorus onto iron oxides. Would you get that in the open ocean? No, because you're not constrained to the small volume.
Right.
But when you are constrained, right, those are things you have to think about. Yeah. No, for the incubation that we did in the Sargasso Sea, we actually did, because we saw such a pronounced effect at that T0, right? We actually did time points every 15, 30 hours. Like we did a much finer scale.
Right.
phosphorus uptake. And we limited ourselves to just a day, actually, because that was all we needed to look at the uptake dynamics.
All right, there are no questions online. Maybe I take the last quick question before we head to lunch. You showed the different solubility of phosphorus in these two different volcanic ashes from these two eruptions.
Yeah.
And a naive question, I'm not a volcano expert, but
Me neither.
is there the gaseous emissions if one volcano, you argued with size, and that made all sense, surface to volume ratio. But if one volcano has more emissions of H2S or SO2, maybe that can, the gas phase. I mean, every volcano spits out a little bit different gas phase composition. Could that be another potential explanation or so? Did you look into something like that?
Absolutely, and that's also what we saw.
Okay.
So we did a surface sensitive technique called HPS, or XPS, sorry. And we saw enhanced fluorine on the surface of the Cumbre Vieja samples, and that was suggestive of his dissolution by hydrofluoric acid. Yes, more into processing.
Well, very quick.
Yeah, very quick. You mentioned at the very beginning, but you didn't get back to it. The mystery of how do these large particles get transported across the whole Atlantic?
Yeah.
And I'm waiting for the answer.
I can tell you in part what we've observed. I think there's more to it than what we've looked at, quite frankly. Part of it is definitely the aspect ratio. So the large particles that make it across have a very high aspect ratio. One of the observations that we've had, particularly in the winter, is that the dust that gets transported from Africa is coming from this place called the Beaudelet Depression. And that used to be Mega Lake Chad, which had a lot of freshwater diatoms. So what happened is the lake desiccated, and now you have all this fossilized, what's called diatomite. And I kind of think of the diatomite as like a flying squirrel. So it's this long tubular particle, and it has all these holes punched in it. So it looks like a rigatoni with all these holes punched in it. And it has a very high surface, a high aspect ratio. It has a lower density than dust. So the density is about a factor of 3 lower than for traditional mineral dust. And because it's lighter and it's less spherical, I think there's just so much drag on these particles that that's how they're making it. I think there's other things at play, though. I think it really requires particle physics married with understanding dynamics. As part of it surely has to be, the layers and where the dust is being transported. There's been some work that suggested that because the African dust has a lot of hematite, it absorbs solar radiation really well. And so you get diurnal convection, where the dust can sort of heat up and stay lofted above the marine boundary layer, cools at night, and then it sort of lofts again during the day. It's a mystery, but I think it's going to require multiple disciplines to really tackle this question. And honestly, more aircraft data looking at smart air layer.
All right, that's a good point to end. Go for lunch. Thank you, Cassie, for that really nice talk.